Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into the realm of an entity who controls something you desperately need right now, sleep itself. As you settle in, imagine a figure shrouded in darkness, moving silently through the night, touching the eyelids of mortals and immortals alike, bringing the sweet relief of slumber to the weary. This is Hypnos, the Greek god of sleep, a deity so powerful that even the mighty Zeus couldn't resist his influence. If you were to encounter him in ancient Greece, you probably wouldn't survive the meeting with your consciousness intact. His mere presence could send you spiraling into the deepest sleep you've ever experienced. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing at the threshold of understanding one of mythology's most peculiar paradoxes, the god of sleep, who never needed sleep himself. Hypnos, whose very name forms the root of words like hypnosis and hypnotic in our modern language, existed in a constant state of wakefulness while bestowing the gift of rest upon others. Think about that for a moment. The being responsible for your deepest slumbers never experienced the refreshment of sleep himself. It's like discovering your barista has never tasted coffee, or your massage therapist has never received a massage. There's something almost cruel about it, isn't there? As you wander through the misty landscapes of Greek mythology, you notice that Hypnos occupies a curious position in the pantheon. Unlike the Olympians, with their dramatic feuds and grand temples, Hypnos operates in the shadows, in the liminal spaces between consciousness and unconsciousness. He's not celebrated with elaborate festivals or worshipped with grand sacrifices. Instead, his power touches every living being, divine or mortal, as an inescapable necessity. You might wonder, as many scholars have, why the ancient Greeks conceptualized sleep as a god who himself never sleeps. Historians still argue whether this represents a sophisticated understanding of sleep's relentless nature or simply highlights the ironic humor that often permeates Greek mythology. Perhaps they understood, even then, that sleep itself is a force that never rests, constantly at work, somewhere in the world, touching someone's eyes, regardless of time or place. As you contemplate Hypnos's eternal wakefulness, you realize that, unlike most Greek gods, who often behaved like overgrown teenagers with cosmic powers, Hypnos displays a certain maturity. He doesn't engage in the petty squabbles that consume Olympus. He doesn't chase after nymphs with questionable consent practices. Well, mostly. We'll get to his marriage later. Instead, he performs his duty with quiet, unrelenting consistency. You reach out to touch the concept of this sleepless sleep god and find it strangely comforting. In modern terms, Hypnos would be that friend who's always available for a 3 a.m. crisis call, never annoyed at being woken up because, well, he wasn't sleeping anyway. Oh, you're having an existential crisis at the witching hour? No problem. I was just hanging out in my cave of eternal night, doing absolutely nothing important. As you continue your mental journey, you learn that the Greeks portrayed Hypnos as a young man with wings, sometimes sprouting from his shoulders, sometimes from his temples. These wings weren't the majestic eagle wings of more prominent gods, but gentler, often resembling those of a butterfly or nightbird. They allowed him to move swiftly and silently over the world, delivering sleep with the lightest touch. In your mind's eye, you see his face, serene, peaceful, with eyes that somehow appear both open and closed simultaneously. His expression holds the secret knowledge of all the world's rest, every dream ever dreamed, every snore ever snorted, and yet he himself remains untouched by drowsiness. You have to admit, it sounds exhausting to never experience the very thing you're in charge of. It's like being the god of chocolate, but having a severe cocoa allergy. One particularly obscure legend, known only to the most dedicated ancient sleep enthusiasts. Yes, they existed. Insomniacs have always looked for solutions. Suggests that Hypnos actually did sleep once, at the very beginning of time. This single experience of slumber was supposedly so profound and perfect that he never needed to sleep again, carrying the essence of that perfect rest within him eternally. It's the mythological equivalent of, I tried it once in college, didn't see what the big deal was. As you ponder this sleepless deity, you begin to appreciate the subtle genius of his conception. The Greeks understood something fundamental about sleep. It's not merely the absence of wakefulness, but an active state with its own powers and mysteries. By personifying sleep as an ever wakeful god, they acknowledged the paradoxical nature of slumber, that it works on us even as we lose consciousness of its workings. You start to feel your own eyelids growing heavy as you contemplate Hypnos. Maybe that's his power at work, reaching across millennia to touch you through nothing more than the mention of his name. Perhaps that's why he needed no grand temples. Every bedroom is his shrine, every pillow his altar, every night his ceremony. The gentle irony of falling asleep while learning about the God who never sleeps himself isn't lost on you. It's exactly what Hypnos would want, his ultimate compliment. Because unlike those showboat Olympians who demanded constant attention and praise, Hypnos's true power is realized in the moment you forget him completely, drifting off into the very realm he governs. As your thoughts begin to drift and blur around the edges, remember that you're experiencing something this powerful deity never knew: the surrender to sleep, the blessed relief of consciousness taking a break. In that way, perhaps you possess something even a god might envy. As you drift deeper into the mythology surrounding Hypnos, you become aware of the fascinating family dynamics that shaped this sleepless deity. Like many of us, Hypnos was defined partly by his family relationships, though his relatives make even the most dysfunctional Thanksgiving dinner seem positively mundane by comparison. You discover that Hypnos was born to Nyx, the primordial goddess of night herself. This makes perfect sense when you think about it. Who better to parent sleep than night? Nyx was one of the oldest deities in Greek mythology, emerging directly from chaos at the beginning of creation. Unlike the later Olympian gods with their all too human dramas, Nyx belonged to an older, more elemental generation of divinities who personified the fundamental forces of existence. As you visualize Nyx, you see her as a shadowy figure draped in darkness, with stars woven into her flowing hair. Her presence brings the cool relief of darkness after the blazing heat of day. In her obsidian palace, located somewhere in the shadowy reaches of the cosmos, she raised her numerous children, each representing some aspect of the darkness or its effects. Talk about a full house. Nyx makes those reality TV families with 19 kids look like amateurs. You try to imagine growing up with night as your mother. Did she pack darkness-themed lunches? Here's your ambrosia sandwich, cut into bat shapes, and a thermos of liquid shadow. Have a good day at deity school, sweetie. The mental image makes you smile as you sink deeper into your pillow. Hesiod's Theogony, one of our primary sources for Greek genealogy, tells us that Nyx bore her children parthenogenetically, meaning without a male partner. This rather unusual reproductive approach resulted in a brood of children who collectively represented some of the most mysterious and feared aspects of existence. You realize that Hypnos came from ancient mythology's version of a single parent household, though with considerably more cosmic significance than most. Among Hypnos's many siblings were entities like Moros, doom, Kur, violent death, Thanatos, peaceful death, Oises, misery, Momus, blame, Nemesis, retribution, Apate, deceit, and the three fates. Family reunions must have been absolutely delightful affairs. So, how's the doom business going these days? Misery, you're looking particularly gloomy tonight. And deceit, is that a new haircut? Or are you just lying again? You find yourself particularly intrigued by the relationship between Hypnos and his twin brother, Thanatos. While Hypnos represented sleep, Thanatos embodied peaceful, non-violent death. The ancients observed the obvious similarity between sleep and death. Both states involve a loss of consciousness, a stillness of the body, and a departure, temporary or permanent, from active life. As you contemplate this, you realize that the Greeks were making a profound observation about human experience, recognizing sleep as a kind of small death we experience nightly. Some obscure Orphic texts even suggest that Hypnos and Thanatos were conjoined twins at birth, physically connected until Nyx separated them to fulfill their distinct cosmic functions. Historians still argue whether this bizarre detail was a later addition or represents an authentic early understanding of the sleep-death relationship. Either way, it underscores how intertwined these concepts were in the Greek imagination. You picture the twin brothers side by side, Hypnos gentle and quiet, Thanatos solemn and inevitable. Perhaps they shared inside jokes that only personifications of consciousness-altering states could appreciate. Hey, brother, remember that time you put Zeus to sleep and I almost took him? Good times. In artwork, they were often depicted together, sometimes carrying the body of the warrior Sarpedon from the battlefield of Troy, as described in Homer's Iliad, one of the rare instances where sleep and death work together directly in mythology. As you sink deeper into your research on this divine family tree, you notice something curious about how the Greeks conceptualized these primal forces. Unlike the Olympians, who were worshipped with elaborate rituals and temples, Nyx and her children represented forces too fundamental, too inevitable, to require propitiation. You don't bargain with night or sleep or death. You simply acknowledge their power and submit to their necessity. You learn that in some lesser known cult practices, particularly in regions of ancient Anatolia, small household shrines dedicated to Hypnos and Nyx together were not uncommon. These weren't grand temples, but intimate sacred spaces where people might leave small offerings before bed, a drop of wine, a pinch of sleep inducing herbs like valerian or lavender, a whispered prayer for restful sleep. It's not so different from your own bedtime rituals. The melatonin supplement on your nightstand might as well be an offering to the modern incarnation of Hypnos. The connection between Hypnos and his brother Thanatos appears most vividly in Greek funerary art, where sleep was often used as a euphemism for death. Beautiful reliefs showing peacefully sleeping figures adorned many ancient tombs, suggesting that death was but a longer, deeper sleep. You find this oddly comforting as you nestle deeper under your blankets, thinking about how these ancient people found ways to make the frightening prospect of death more bearable by associating it with the familiar comfort of sleep. Perhaps the most peculiar aspect of this family dynamic was how Hypnos managed to maintain a relatively benevolent reputation despite his rather ominous family connections. While his siblings dealt in doom, death, and misery, Hypnos offered the sweet relief of rest to the weary. It's as if he was the one well adjusted kid from a family of Goths. Yes, my mother is literal darkness, and my twin brother is death itself. But I'm just here to help you get some rest after a long day. Though born from darkness, Hypnos didn't inherit his mother's primordial, somewhat frightening nature. Instead, he developed into a more nuanced figure, capable of both kindness and mischief. His ability to overcome even Zeus's indefatigable divine energy demonstrated his considerable power, yet he wielded it with a gentleness that his siblings often lacked. As you feel yourself growing even more relaxed, you appreciate how Hypnos managed to become the most welcomed member of his rather intimidating family. After all, who doesn't eventually surrender willingly to sleep? Even the most resistance prone toddler or the most stressed out adult eventually succumbs to Hypnos's gentle touch. Perhaps that was his greatest achievement, making his inevitable power feel like a gift rather than an imposition. As you continue your mythological journey, you're now approaching the mysterious dwelling place of Hypnos. Unlike the Olympian gods, with their shining palaces atop Mount Olympus, Hypnos preferred a more secluded residence, one that perfectly reflected his nature and function. You find yourself standing at the western edge of the world, where the sun completes its daily journey and sinks below the horizon. Here, in a liminal space between light and darkness, you discover the entrance to Hypnos's legendary cave. Some accounts place this cave on the island of Lemnos, while others situate it in a mysterious region called Cimmeria, a land shrouded in perpetual mist and twilight. Homer describes it as a place where the sun never shows his face, neither when he climbs up the starry heaven, nor when he turns again to earth from heaven. But terrible night spreads over wretched mortals. As you approach the cave entrance, you notice how the surrounding landscape transitions. The vibrant colors of the living world gradually fade into muted tones of gray and blue. The sounds of birds and wildlife grow quieter until they're replaced by a profound silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of emptiness, but the peaceful quiet of perfect rest. It's like walking through your noisy neighborhood at 3 a.m. when even the most determined night owls have finally called it quits. You're struck by the abundance of poppies growing around the cave entrance, their vivid red standing out against the otherwise subdued landscape. These weren't just decorative. The ancient Greeks well understood the sleep-inducing properties of the poppy from which opium is derived, long before modern pharmaceutical companies package sleep aids in convenient blister packs. Ancient insomniacs might have used poppy extracts to court the favor of Hypnos. Think of it as the original Ambien, but with considerably more religious significance, and without those awkward side effects of sleep eating or sleep Amazon shopping. As you step closer to the entrance, you feel a cool mist caressing your skin. This mist, neither quite liquid nor quite air, emerges from the cave and creates a boundary between the waking world and the realm of sleep. Scholars have debated whether this mist was meant to represent the hypnagogic state, that strange, floating sensation you experience just before falling asleep, when reality begins to dissolve around the edges and dream logic starts to take hold. At the threshold of the cave, you pause, noticing that no sunlight penetrates beyond this point. The cave defies the normal laws of nature. No matter the time of day, no matter how bright the sun might shine outside, not a single ray ever illuminates the interior. This isn't just poetic description, it's a fundamental aspect of Hypnos's domain. Sleep requires darkness, and in the realm of the sleep god, darkness is absolute and eternal. You gather your courage and step inside, immediately feeling a change in the atmosphere. The air is thick but not unpleasant, like being wrapped in an invisible weighted blanket. The temperature is perfect, not too warm, not too cold, but precisely calibrated to induce drowsiness. It reminds you of that ideal bedroom temperature that sleep experts are always recommending, but your thermostat never quite achieves. As your eyes adjust to the darkness, though adjust isn't quite right since there's no light to adjust to, you begin to perceive the interior through other senses. The ground beneath your feet feels soft and yielding, like walking on a mattress, perfectly calibrated to support your specific body type. The walls seem to absorb sound rather than reflect it, creating an acoustic environment of perfect quiet where even your thoughts seem muffled and distant. You notice a gentle sound that you initially mistook for silence. It's the sound of the river Lethe flowing through the cave, its waters murmuring a lullaby as ancient as time itself. In Greek mythology, Lethe was one of the 5 rivers of the underworld, specifically associated with forgetfulness and oblivion. Those who drank from it experienced complete amnesia, forgetting their former lives, a concept not entirely unlike what happens during deep sleep, when consciousness and memory temporarily suspend. One particularly quirky tidbit from an obscure Greek text suggests that Hypnos's cave contained a special chamber where dreams were brewed like potions, mixing elements of memory, desire, fear, and imagination in different proportions to create the specific dream experiences he would deliver each night. If true, it would mean Hypnos was the original mixologist, crafting bespoke nocturnal experiences millennia before craft cocktail bars started charging $18 for drinks with unnecessary smoke effects. Deeper in the cave, you encounter the sleeping chambers themselves, countless alcoves and recesses where different types of sleep reside. There's the shallow antechamber of light dozing, the deeper chamber of REM sleep where dreams flourish, and the innermost sanctum of deep delta wave sleep where even Hypnos himself rarely ventures. Historians still argue whether these distinctions in sleep architecture were recognized by the ancient Greeks, or if modern scholars are retroactively imposing our scientific understanding onto mythological structures. You notice that the cave isn't guarded by fierce monsters or imposing barriers, like many divine dwellings in Greek mythology. Instead, its primary protection is its own nature, the overwhelming somnolence that permeates every molecule of air makes unauthorized access nearly impossible. Any intruder would simply collapse into sleep before penetrating its depths. Its security through drowsiness, far more effective than a simple lock and key. According to Ovid, the entrance to the cave was guarded by poppies and other soporific herbs, with clusters of night's darkest dreams clinging to the ceiling like sleeping bats. At the center lies an ebony bed. Of course, what else would the sleep god sleep on, if he ever did sleep, draped with dark blankets, where Hypnos himself reclines, eternally wakeful, yet perpetually at rest. As you wander further into this somnolent realm, you notice shadowy figures moving with languid grace through the darkness. These are the Oneiroi, the dreams and dream spirits, Hypnos' children, preparing for their nightly work of visiting sleepers. They take little notice of you, absorbed in their own mysterious preparations, collecting fragments of memories and emotions to weave into the night's dreams. The cave of Hypnos represents a perfect inversion of normal existence. In the waking world, darkness is temporary, regularly banished by the return of the sun. But here, in the domain of sleep, darkness is the permanent condition, and wakefulness is the temporary intrusion. As you feel the weight of the cave's influence pulling at your consciousness, you recognize that you're experiencing the very essence of hypnosis power, not just the absence of wakefulness, but the positive presence of sleep itself, as tangible and real as any physical force. Standing in the depths of Hypnos' cave, you begin to wonder exactly how this peculiar deity manages to exert such profound influence over gods and mortals alike. What special abilities allow him to overcome even divine resistance to bring the sweet relief of slumber? Unlike gods who hurl thunderbolts or command the seas, Hypnos' power operates with subtle precision, slipping past the most vigilant defenses. You learn that Hypnos possessed several implements through which he channeled his sleep-inducing abilities. Chief among these was a branch dripping with water from the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. With the lightest touch of this branch on the eyelids, Hypnos could send even the most determined insomniac tumbling into the depths of slumber. For more resistant subjects, looking at you, Zeus, he might use his horn of sleep, from which he poured drowsiness directly into their minds like a cosmic anesthesiologist, administering the perfect dose. What makes Hypnos truly remarkable among the pantheon is that his power knows no hierarchy. While most divine abilities respected the established order of authority, with Zeus at the top of the pyramid, generally immune to other gods' manipulations, Hypnos could affect literally anyone. Zeus himself, the king of gods, was not exempt from sleep's gentle but irresistible dominion. This democratic quality of sleep, the fact that it eventually comes for everyone regardless of status, resonated with the ancient Greeks, who recognized sleep as one of the great equalizers in human experience. You find yourself contemplating the mechanics of divine sleep. Did immortal gods actually need sleep, biologically speaking? The myths are inconsistent on this point. Historians still argue whether the gods' susceptibility to sleep was merely a literary device to make them more relatable, or if it represented a genuine theological belief that even divinity required periods of rest. Perhaps their need for sleep was not physical, but psychological. Even an immortal mind might need occasional respite from eternal existence. As you explore deeper into the lore, you discover that Hypnos didn't just have an on-off switch for consciousness. His control over sleep was nuanced and sophisticated. He could induce anything from a light doze to a sleep so profound it mimicked death. He could bestow restful slumber filled with pleasant dreams, or punish his enemies with nightmares and restlessness. He could make a moment of sleep feel like hours, or stretch hours of sleep to seem like mere moments. One of Hypnos's most extraordinary abilities was distance manipulation. Unlike other gods who typically needed proximity to their targets, Hypnos could exert his influence from afar. From the depths of his cave, he could reach across the world to touch the eyelids of someone in need of rest. This remote operation made him particularly difficult to avoid or resist. You couldn't exactly outrun or hide from sleep, could you? You're amused to learn about a particularly quirky aspect of Hypnos's power set, his ability to induce selective sleep. According to an obscure text found in fragments from a temple near Epidaurus, Hypnos could put specific parts of the body to sleep while leaving others wakeful. This peculiar talent was sometimes requested by those suffering from localized pain. Athletes with injuries or women in childbirth might pray to Hypnos to numb only the afflicted area while allowing them to remain otherwise alert. It's basically the mythological equivalent of local anesthesia, thousands of years before modern medicine developed the concept. The most impressive demonstrations of Hypnos's powers come from his encounters with Zeus himself. On multiple occasions, Hypnos managed to overcome the resistance of the king of gods, putting him into deep slumber at critically important moments. That's no small feat, considering Zeus's famous vigilance and power. Imagine having successfully sedated the supreme ruler of the universe twice on your divine resume. It certainly trumps your managed a team of 3 interns professional achievement. What made Hypnos's power particularly insidious was its gentleness. Unlike other forms of divine subjugation, that involved violence or obvious coercion, sleep comes softly, often welcomed by its victims. Even when Zeus was tricked into slumber, he didn't experience it as an attack, but as a pleasure. There's something almost subversively clever about a power that makes its targets thank you for subduing them. You learn that Hypnos had particular dominion over the twilight hours, that liminal time when day surrenders to night. During this period, his powers were said to be at their peak, and those trying to resist sleep found their resolve weakening as the sun disappeared below the horizon. The Greeks observed this natural phenomenon, the increased drowsiness that often comes with darkness, and attributed it to Hypnos's growing influence as his mother Nyx, night, spread her dark mantle across the sky. Among Hypnos's more specialized abilities was dream manipulation, while his sons, the Oneiroi, were primarily responsible for the content of dreams. Hypnos himself controlled their intensity, duration, and memorability. He determined whether you would remember your dreams vividly upon waking or whether they would fade like morning mist, leaving only the vague impression that you dreamed something important, but can't quite recall what it was. You know, that annoying feeling you had just this morning when you woke up. The means by which Hypnos delivered sleep varied according to cultural needs and individual circumstances. For warriors seeking rest before battle, he might offer a deep, restorative slumber that left them refreshed and ready for combat. For the suffering or the elderly, he could provide the gentle comfort of light sleep, allowing them to drift in and out of consciousness without the disorientation of deeper slumber. For lovers, he might delay his arrival, granting them extended hours of wakefulness together, or he might hasten it for those seeking to escape emotional pain. One of the most fascinating aspects of Hypnos's power was its relationship with time perception. Inside the realm of sleep, time moves differently. Dreams that seem to last hours can occur in minutes or even seconds of actual sleep. This temporal distortion was considered one of Hypnos's most mysterious abilities. The Greeks observed that during sleep, our normal experience of time suspends, and they attributed this phenomenon to Hypnos's divine influence over the sleeping mind. You find yourself growing increasingly drowsy as you contemplate these powers. Is it just the natural effect of thinking about sleep? Or is Hypnos himself reaching across millennia to demonstrate his timeless abilities? Either way, you sink deeper into comfort, imagining the gentle touch of a poppy-laden branch across your eyelids, the soft murmur of the river Lethe in your ears, as the god who never sleeps brings you ever closer to his peaceful domain. As your journey through the mythology of sleep continues, you now find yourself encountering the most fascinating extension of Hypnos's influence, his numerous children, the Oneiroi. These divine beings, numbering in the thousands, according to some accounts, serve as the administrators of the dream world, each specializing in different aspects of the nocturnal experiences that visit us when we surrender to their Father's power. Chief among these dream spirits is Morpheus, whose name might sound familiar even if you've never cracked open a book of Greek mythology. That's because his name lives on in our modern pharmacopoeia as morphine, one of medicine's most powerful sleep and pain inducing drugs. The connection isn't coincidental. Both the god and the medication deliver profound alterations to consciousness. Morpheus specialized specifically in shaping dreams that featured human forms and characters. When you dream of your friends, family, or that awkward conversation with your third grade teacher that still haunts you decades later, that's Morpheus's handiwork. You picture Morpheus as a shapeshifter, constantly flowing between different human appearances. In one moment, he might wear the face of your mother. In the next, he transforms into your college roommate, or that barista who always gets your name wrong. This fluidity made him particularly effective at creating convincing dream scenarios featuring people you know, sometimes so convincing that upon waking, you might genuinely believe you had an actual conversation with someone who was, in reality, nowhere near you. While Morpheus gets the lion's share of fame among the dream spirits, he even got his own franchise in the Matrix. He's actually just one of three principal Oneiroi mentioned by name in classical sources. You're now meeting his brothers, each with their own dream specialties. Phobator, whose name gives us the word phobia, handled the frightening dreams populated by animals and monsters. He's the one responsible for that recurring nightmare where you're being chased by a half scorpion, half your high school principal through an abandoned shopping mall. Thanks for nothing, Phobator. The third named brother, Thanatos, created dreams of inanimate objects and surreal environments. That dream where your house has impossible architecture, with doors opening into oceans and staircases leading to nowhere, that's pure Thanatos. He's essentially the Salvador Dali of divine dream crafters, specializing in the weird, impossible scenarios that defy waking logic. In modern terms, he'd be the indie experimental filmmaker to Morpheus's mainstream Hollywood director. Beyond these three famous brothers stretched a vast network of lesser Oneiroi, each with increasingly specialized dream functions. According to an obscure papyrus fragment discovered near ancient Halicarnassus, there existed dream spirits dedicated solely to specific scenarios, one who crafted only dreams of falling, another who specialized in dreams of public speaking disasters, and even one dedicated exclusively to those dreams where your teeth fall out. Talk about niche career paths. Imagine introducing yourself at divine networking events. Hi, I'm Dentaphobitor, god of tooth loss anxiety dreams. Let me give you my cloud tablet contact information. The organization of these dream spirits followed a complex hierarchy that mirrored human bureaucracy in amusingly specific ways. Historians still argue whether this administrative structure was an actual theological belief or merely a literary invention to help classify the bewildering variety of dream experiences. Either way, ancient dream interpreters would often try to determine which specific oneros had sent a particular dream to better understand its significance. What makes the Oneiroi particularly interesting is their method of dream delivery. Unlike modern conceptions of dreams as internally generated phenomena, the Greeks believed dreams physically visited sleepers. The Oneiroi would leave Hypnos' cave each night, taking flight on their silent wings, and enter the mortal world through one of two gates, the gate of horn or the gate of ivory. Dreams passing through the horn gate were true prophetic visions, while those coming through the ivory gate were false or deceptive. This distinction created a convenient theological loophole. If your dream prediction didn't come true, clearly it came through the ivory gate. The dream wasn't wrong. You just misidentified its entrance point. Ancient dream interpreters had excellent job security with this kind of built-in excuse. You learn that the Oneiroi didn't just randomly assign dreams to sleepers. Their work was sometimes directed by other gods who wished to communicate with or influence mortals. Apollo might commission a prophetic dream from Morpheus, or Aphrodite might request a passionate, romantic dream for someone she favored. In this way, the dream spirits served as messengers and intermediaries between gods and sleeping humans. Think of them as the original dream influencers doing sponsored content for the major Olympian brands. Perhaps the most curious aspect of the Oneiroi was their physical form. Unlike their ever awake father, they possessed the ability to sleep themselves, often during daylight hours when their services weren't required. When inactive, they hung like bats from the ceiling of Hypnos's cave, swaying gently in the perpetual darkness. The image is simultaneously comical and slightly unsettling. Thousands of slumbering dream spirits dangling overhead, occasionally twitching as they perhaps experienced their own meta dreams. What does a dream god dream about? Perhaps they dream of being awake, creating a recursive loop of consciousness that would make even the most dedicated philosophy major's head spin. The relationship between Hypnos and his children was cooperative but hierarchical, while the Oneiroi had significant autonomy in crafting dream content. Their father controlled access to the sleeping mind itself. Without Hypnos's preliminary work of inducing slumber, the dream spirits would find themselves locked out, unable to perform their specialized functions. It's like Hypnos was running the exclusive nightclub of unconsciousness, and the Oneiroi were the featured entertainment that could only perform once patrons had been admitted. As you contemplate these busy dream spirits fluttering nightly from their dark cave to bedrooms worldwide, you might wonder if they ever get tired of their endless work. Do they ever experience burnout from crafting billions of dreams every night? Do they have professional development seminars to keep their dream crafting skills fresh and relevant? This century's sleepers are expecting far more complex narrative structures in their anxiety dreams. Let's workshop some new approaches in today's session. Whether you remember your dreams vividly or rarely recall them at all, the Oneiroi have visited you countless times throughout your life, painting on the canvas of your sleeping mind with their divine brushes. And as you feel yourself drifting closer to sleep now, perhaps you'll glimpse their shadowy wings at the edges of your fading consciousness, waiting to begin their nightly work once again. As your eyelids grow heavier and your mind drifts deeper into the mythology of sleep, you arrive at one of the most dramatic episodes in Hypnos's divine career, his first attempt to overcome the almighty Zeus. This wasn't just any minor mischief, it was a high-stakes intervention in one of the most famous conflicts in Greek mythology, the Trojan War. The stage for this audacious sleep operation was set by Hera, Zeus's wife, and queen of the gods. As you might recall from other mythological bedtime stories, Hera and Zeus didn't exactly have the healthiest marriage. Their relationship was marked by Zeus's constant infidelities and Hera's equally constant schemes for revenge. During the Trojan War, these marital issues became entangled with international conflict, creating the perfect storm for Hypnos's involvement. You see, Zeus had strictly forbidden the gods from interfering in the Trojan War, but like a parent who tells their children not to eat cookies and then immediately leaves the room, he should have known better. The Olympians simply couldn't resist meddling in human affairs, especially in a war as juicy and dramatic as this one. Hera, in particular, had a strong anti Trojan bias. She had never forgiven the Trojan prince Paris for judging Aphrodite more beautiful than her in that infamous divine beauty contest. If you thought high school popularity competitions could lead to drama, they had nothing on the fallout from this celestial pageant. Hera devised a plan to help the Greeks gain advantage in the war, but she needed Zeus temporarily out of the picture to pull it off. That's where our sleep-inducing friend Hypnos enters the narrative. Hera approached the god of sleep with an audacious request: put the king of gods into a deep slumber so she could meddle in the war without his knowledge. This wasn't just asking someone to distract your boss while you take an extra long lunch break. This was cosmic insubordination of the highest order. You might wonder why Hypnos would even consider such a dangerous task. The answer lies in divine bribery. According to Homer's Iliad, Hera promised Hypnos a magnificent gift, a beautiful golden throne crafted by Hephaestus himself, plus a footstool to rest his immortal feet. Apparently, even gods appreciate good ergonomic furniture. It's comforting to know that even divine beings can be swayed by the prospect of comfortable seating. Perhaps there's a bit of God in all of us when we covet that perfect recliner at the furniture store. After some initial hesitation, putting Zeus to sleep without permission wasn't exactly a low-risk activity. Hypnos agreed to Hera's proposal. The plan required Hera to first seduce her own husband, a scenario that adds a layer of marital manipulation that would make any relationship counselor wince. She borrowed Aphrodite's cestus, a magical belt that enhanced her attractiveness and kindled desire in anyone who beheld her. Think of it as the original push-up bra, but with divine enchantments that make modern cosmetics seem positively amateur by comparison. You can picture the scene as Hera approaches Zeus on Mount Ida, looking uncharacteristically alluring and making up a story about wanting to reconcile after one of their many arguments. Zeus, never one to refuse an attractive offer, which was the source of about 90% of their marital problems in the first place, was completely taken in as the divine couple engaged in what Homer delicately calls the pleasures of love. Hypnos seized his moment, transforming himself into a small night bird. Some sources specify a nightjar, appropriately enough. Hypnos perched on a nearby tree, waiting for the perfect moment. Once Zeus was sufficiently, relaxed, Hypnos fluttered down silently and cast his most powerful sleep over the king of gods. Zeus's omnipotent eyelids grew heavy, his divine vigilance faded, and the ruler of the universe drifted into a profound post-coital slumber that would have put even the most exhausted mortal's nap to shame. With Zeus safely snoring away, did gods snore? Historians still argue whether divine respiration included such mundane imperfections, though several vase paintings do show Zeus with his mouth comically agape during this episode. Hera was free to act. She immediately stirred up a massive storm that blew the Trojan hero Hector and his forces off course, giving the Greeks a much needed advantage in the war. One particularly obscure version of this tale, preserved only in fragments from a minor poet from Rhodes, suggests that Hypnos didn't just put Zeus to sleep, but actually manipulated his dreams during this slumber. Supposedly, he filled the god's sleeping mind with pleasant memories of past conquests and victories, ensuring that Zeus remained contentedly distracted in the landscape of his own ego, while reality was being rearranged around him. It's the divine equivalent of putting on a nature documentary to keep a toddler occupied while you rearrange the living room furniture. The scheme worked perfectly until it didn't. When Zeus eventually awoke, the exact duration of divine sleep isn't specified, but apparently, even immortal naps must end eventually. He immediately sensed that something was amiss. The battlefield situation had changed dramatically. His brother Poseidon had joined the fray, despite explicit instructions not to interfere. And Hera was looking suspiciously innocent, always a red flag in divine politics. You can imagine Zeus putting the pieces together, his face darkening like storm clouds gathering. Divine detection didn't require complicated forensic science. Zeus knew exactly what had happened and who was responsible. His anger was terrible to behold, like the moment when your parent discovers you've been playing video games all night when you were supposed to be studying for finals, except with more lightning bolts and cosmic threats. Zeus's fury fell first on Hera, whom he threatened with the same violent punishment he'd given other disobedient immortals. But his rage soon extended to the true facilitator of this celestial coup, Hypnos himself. The god of sleep suddenly found himself in the uncomfortable position of being hunted by the most powerful deity in existence. No amount of ergonomic, golden furniture seemed worth that risk in hindsight. What's particularly interesting about this episode is how it demonstrates the limitations of even the mightiest gods. Zeus, for all his supreme power, remained vulnerable to basic bodily needs and pleasures. He could be seduced, he could be lulled to sleep, and his attention could be diverted. All very human weaknesses for the supposedly perfect divine king. The Greeks, for all their reverence toward their gods, weren't afraid to portray them with flaws and foibles that mirrored mortal experiences. As you feel your own consciousness beginning to fade, pulled toward Hypnos' realm, just like Zeus on Mount Ida, you recognize that this tale reveals something profound about the Greek concept of sleep. They saw it not just as a physical necessity, but as a powerful force that could overcome even the most formidable resistance. Perhaps that's why they personified it as a god who never needed rest himself. Only a being of extraordinary power could repeatedly conquer the unconquerable. Having successfully put Zeus to sleep during a critical moment in the Trojan War, Hypnos now found himself in a predicament that would make any divine being quake with fear. Zeus was awake, aware, and absolutely furious. We're talking about the kind of anger that creates new weather patterns, the original storming out of the room, but with actual lightning bolts involved. You can picture the scene. Zeus, rising from his post-nap disorientation, quickly realizing the battlefield situation had dramatically changed during his slumber, and connecting the dots to Hypnos's interference. The king of gods wasn't exactly known for his measured responses to perceived slights. This was the deity who once turned an entire mountain of challengers into stone and regularly hurled thunderbolts at anyone who annoyed him slightly. Divine HR had long ago given up on getting Zeus to attend anger management seminars, as Zeus's rage built to cataclysmic levels. Hypnos did what any sensible immortal would do when facing the wrath of the universe's most powerful being. He ran, fleeing from Mount Ida with impressive speed for someone who specialized in unconsciousness. Hypnos didn't head back to his cave. That would be too obvious. Instead, he sought protection from the one being in existence that even Zeus approached with caution, his mother, Night herself. You follow Hypnos as he rushes to Nyx, his powerful, primordial mother. Unlike the Olympians, who were relatively young gods in cosmic terms, Nyx was ancient, one of the original deities born from chaos at the beginning of creation. This seniority granted her a degree of respect and fear that even Zeus couldn't ignore. It's like running home to your grandmother, who, despite her gentle appearance, once made the school principal apologize to you after a single disapproving glance. Hypnos flung himself into his mother's dark embrace, explaining his predicament between panicked breaths. Nyx, hearing that Zeus was threatening her child, did what protective mothers have done throughout time. She prepared to fight for her offspring, night gathering her darkness around her like armor is a chilling image, and even Zeus, upon following Hypnos to the edge of night's domain, paused at this display of primordial power. According to Hesiod, Zeus halted his pursuit at the threshold of night's dwelling, unwilling to offend the ancient goddess by violating her domain. Even for the king of gods, there were certain boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, certain forces too fundamental to challenge directly. Night was one such force, older than the gods, deeper than divine law, essential to the very structure of existence. Disrupting her could have cosmic consequences that even Zeus wasn't willing to risk. This standoff between Zeus and Nyx represents a fascinating aspect of Greek cosmology, the recognition that the Olympian gods, for all their power, were not the oldest or most fundamental forces in the universe. They ruled within a framework established by earlier, more elemental powers. It's like how your apartment building manager might seem all powerful regarding your security deposit, but still has to comply with city zoning laws established long before they took the job. One particularly obscure version of this tale, found only in fragments of a lost work attributed to the poet Bacchylides, suggests that Nyx didn't just shield Hypnos passively, but actively threatened Zeus with eternal darkness if he harmed her son. The fragment describes how night began to stretch her dark mantle across the sky beyond its usual hours, demonstrating her willingness to plunge the world into perpetual darkness, a prospect that would have devastated the mortal world Zeus was ostensibly responsible for protecting. It's the divine equivalent of a parent saying, "Keep messing with my kid, and I'll make everyone miserable." Faced with night's implicit threat and unwilling to risk cosmic imbalance, Zeus reluctantly withdrew his immediate rage. He didn't formally forgive Hypnos. Gods, especially chief gods, rarely admit defeat so explicitly, but he tacitly accepted a stalemate. Hypnos would remain under his mother's protection, safe from divine retribution as long as he stayed within her shadowy domain. Historians still argue whether this episode represents an actual theological belief about cosmic hierarchies or simply a narrative convenience to explain why Hypnos wasn't obliterated after his transgression. Some scholars suggest it reflects pre Olympian religious concepts that persisted in Greek mythology, acknowledging the primacy of natural forces, like night and day, over personified deities. Others view it as merely a plot device to keep a useful character in the mythological roster. Either way, it established an important precedent in Hypnos's divine career. He had discovered that his mother's protection could shield him from even the most powerful adversary. This divine standoff created a period of isolation for Hypnos. Confined to his mother's dark realm for protection, he couldn't freely roam the world or Olympus as he once had. You can imagine him sulking in the deepest recesses of night's domain, perhaps reorganizing his collection of dream fragments or alphabetizing his sleep potions to pass the time. Day 47 of Zeus's timeout. I've counted all the stalactites in the cave twice, considering inventing insomnia out of boredom. During this period of effective house arrest, Hypnos continued his essential function of bringing sleep to the world. But he did so remotely, sending his influence out from the safety of his mother's protection rather than delivering it personally. This arm's length approach to his duties made sleep somewhat less effective and more erratic among both mortals and immortals, leading to the first documented period of widespread divine insomnia. Apparently, even gods toss and turn when the sleep deity is operating under restrictions. The standoff between Zeus and Hypnos couldn't last forever. The cosmos needed proper sleep function restored, and Zeus eventually recognized that his ongoing feud with the sleep god was creating more problems than it solved. The first steps toward reconciliation came indirectly through intermediaries, suggesting that both sides might benefit from a truce. Think of it as divine conflict resolution, but with the fate of universal consciousness hanging in the balance instead of just office break room etiquette. What's particularly interesting about this mythological standoff is how it illustrates the interconnected nature of divine powers in Greek theology. No god, not even Zeus, could function properly in isolation from the others. Each divine being fulfilled a necessary cosmic role, and disrupting one rippled through the entire system. Zeus might have been powerful enough to destroy Hypnos, but doing so would have eliminated sleep itself from existence, a consequence too severe even for divine retribution. As you drift closer to your own appointment with sleep, you might appreciate this ancient recognition that rest isn't merely the absence of activity, but a positive, necessary force in both mortal and divine existence, important enough that even the king of gods ultimately had to respect its power and the deity who wielded it. The standoff between Zeus and Hypnos couldn't continue indefinitely. The cosmos needed its sleep regulator, and Hypnos needed more freedom than his mother's shadowy protection could provide long term. What followed was a fascinating exercise in divine diplomacy that would secure Hypnos's position more permanently in the pantheon. You find yourself witnessing the careful negotiations that unfolded during this tense period. Nyx, being one of the primordial deities, possessed significant leverage in these discussions. Unlike the Olympians, who derived their authority from Zeus, Night's power predated the current cosmic order. This gave her considerable negotiating advantages as she worked to secure lasting protection for her son. The first phase of these negotiations involved establishing clear boundaries. Nyx proposed a formal agreement that would acknowledge certain limits to Zeus's authority when it came to punishing fundamental cosmic functions. Sleep, she argued, wasn't merely another minor deity, but an essential process woven into the fabric of existence itself. Disrupting it would have consequences that even the king of gods should wish to avoid. You can picture Nyx and Zeus facing each other at the boundaries of light and darkness, their powerful energies crackling in the liminal space between their domains. Zeus, still irritated but pragmatic enough to recognize the importance of cosmic harmony, listened as Night outlined her terms. There was no conference room large enough for this meeting, no mediator powerful enough to enforce the rules, just two fundamental forces of the universe hashing out their differences while lesser deities nervously watched from a safe distance. According to a particularly interesting clay tablet discovered near ancient Ephesus, this negotiation lasted for 9 days and 9 nights, with neither divine party requiring rest. Ironically enough, the tablet describes how the world experienced strange phenomena during this period. Brief moments of darkness during daylight hours and unusual flashes of light in the deepest night. As the two powers flexed their influence during particularly tense moments in the talks, historians still argue whether this tablet represents an actual theological tradition or merely a local poetic interpretation of unusual meteorological events that occurred around the same time. Some scholars suggest it might be recording an ancient solar eclipse that was retroactively interpreted through mythological frameworks. Others maintain it preserves genuine religious beliefs about divine negotiations affecting natural phenomena. The key breakthrough in these negotiations came when Nyx proposed a clever arrangement. Hypnos would acknowledge Zeus's supreme authority and agree to refrain from interfering with the king of gods without explicit permission. But in exchange, Hypnos would receive formal recognition as the legitimate controller of sleep across all realms, mortal and divine. This authority would be respected even by Zeus himself, who would agree not to arbitrarily fight against natural sleep when it came to him. Think of it as the first divine non-aggression pact, complete with cosmic checks and balances. Hypnos gets official protection and recognition. Zeus maintains his top dog status while gaining a more reliable sleep cycle. It's like when you finally establish ground rules with your roommate after months of passive-aggressive notes about the dishes. Everyone benefits from the clarity. You learn that the agreement included some very specific clauses about when and how Hypnos could exercise his power over Zeus. For instance, naturally occurring sleep was permitted and protected, but manipulated or enchanted sleep, specifically designed to undermine Zeus's authority remained forbidden. It's the divine equivalent of, you can turn off the lights at reasonable bedtime hours, but no slipping melatonin into my ambrosia without consent. One particularly quirky detail from a fragmentary papyrus suggests that the agreement specified exact sleep durations considered appropriate for different classes of beings. Gods were allotted significantly less sleep than mortals, with Zeus requiring the least of all, just enough to refresh his divine energy without significantly interrupting his cosmic oversight. Heroes received more than gods, but less than ordinary mortals, reflecting their intermediate status. It's like a divine sleep recommendation chart. Thousands of years before modern sleep scientists started telling us exactly how many hours we should spend unconscious. As part of securing this protection, Hypnos had to make a formal apology to Zeus for the Mount Ida incident, not just a casual, my bad, but an elaborate ritual acknowledgement of overstepping his bounds. You can imagine Hypnos swallowing his pride as he performed this ceremonial contrition, privately thinking that helping Hera was worth the trouble, but publicly displaying appropriate remorse to satisfy divine protocol. It's reminiscent of those childhood apologies your parents forced you to make. I'm sorry, I put you to sleep without permission so Hera could meddle in your war and I could get a golden throne. Technically accurate, but perhaps lacking genuine feeling. With the formal agreement established, Hypnos gradually regained his freedom of movement and operation. He could leave his mother's shadowy realm and return to his own cave, resuming his duties with renewed official status. Sleep returned to its normal patterns across the mortal and divine worlds, much to everyone's relief. Even Zeus benefited from the restored cosmic order, though he would never openly admit it. This episode established an important precedent in divine politics, demonstrating that even the mightiest god could be brought to the negotiating table when fundamental cosmic functions were at stake. It reinforced the Greek conception of a universe governed not by absolute authority, but by a complex web of powers and principles that even Zeus had to respect. For Hypnos personally, this hard-won protection changed his divine career trajectory. No longer just one minor deity among many, he had established himself as an essential cosmic function with officially recognized autonomy. He had faced down the supreme god and emerged, if not victorious, at least secure in his position and purpose. Not bad for a god whose primary skill involves making people unconscious. The agreement between Zeus, Nyx, and Hypnos became a template for resolving other divine conflicts, particularly those involving primordial powers and newer Olympian authorities. It recognized the layered nature of divine society, acknowledging that the cosmos operated according to principles established before the rise of the current pantheon, principles that could bend but not break even under Zeus's mighty influence. As you feel your own consciousness growing heavier, you recognize that you're experiencing the very power that proved important enough to force a compromise from the King of Gods himself. There's something profoundly satisfying about surrendering to a force so fundamental that even Zeus had to acknowledge its necessity and make peace with its divine personification. Despite having narrowly escaped Zeus's wrath the first time, Hypnos would soon find himself drawn into another divine scheme involving the king of gods. You might think that after such a close call, our sleep deity would be more cautious about meddling with Zeus's consciousness. But just as humans rarely learn from history, gods apparently have similar lapses in judgment, especially when the incentives are sufficiently enticing. The setting for this second manipulation once again involved the Trojan War. As this brutal conflict dragged on, the gods continued taking sides and intervening despite Zeus's prohibitions. Hera remained firmly committed to the Greek cause and grew increasingly frustrated with Zeus's support for the Trojans. When the Trojan hero Hector began gaining significant ground against the Greeks, Hera decided another divine intervention was needed. You can picture Hera pacing the gleaming halls of Olympus, devising her plan. She had used seduction successfully before, but Zeus might be suspicious of a second identical approach. She needed a more elaborate scheme this time, and once again, Hypnos would be essential to its success. But after their previous adventure had nearly gotten him obliterated from existence, Hera would need to offer something truly extraordinary to secure his cooperation. Hera approached Hypnos with characteristic divine bluntness. She laid out her plan to seduce Zeus again and requested the sleep god's assistance in ensuring the king of gods remained unconscious long enough for her to aid the Greeks. You can almost see Hypnos's expression, a mixture of disbelief and alarm at being asked to repeat the very action that had nearly led to his destruction. It's like being asked to pull the same prank on the principal after barely avoiding expulsion the first time. Are you out of your immortal mind? He might have responded. The ancient texts are more formal, but the sentiment is clear. Have you forgotten how Zeus nearly hunted me to oblivion last time? I'm still finding singed feathers from all those lightning bolts he hurled my way. Hera, however, came prepared with an offer she knew would be irresistible. She promised Hypnos something far more valuable than the golden throne he'd received for his first intervention: marriage to Pasithea, one of the Charites, or Graces, the goddesses of charm, beauty, and creativity. This was no small offer. The Graces were among the most beautiful and desired goddesses in the pantheon. Pasithea, specifically, was associated with relaxation and altered states of consciousness, making her the perfect divine partner for the god of sleep. It was a match literally made in heaven, a divine power couple whose combined abilities would complement each other perfectly. Think of it as the mythological equivalent of a neuroscientist marrying a meditation expert. Their dinner conversations would be fascinating. According to Homer's Iliad, Hypnos had long desired Pasithea as his bride. Some lesser known fragments from a temple near Epidaurus suggest that Hypnos had previously attempted to court Pasithea, but had been unsuccessful, as the beautiful Grace found his cave dwelling too gloomy and his constant association with unconsciousness conversationally limiting. Historians still argue whether this romantic backstory was part of the original myth or a later embellishment designed to explain why the marriage would be sufficiently motivating to risk Zeus's wrath a second time. You can see Hypnos wavering as he considers Hera's offer. Marriage to Pasithea was tempting beyond measure, but Zeus's fury was no small matter. Perhaps sensing his hesitation, Hera took the extraordinary step of offering a divine oath, the most sacred and binding form of promise available to the gods. She swore by the river Styx the unbreakable oath that even Zeus himself could not violate, that she would indeed give Pasithea to Hypnos if he assisted her plan. This oath changed everything. A promise sworn by the Styx couldn't be broken without catastrophic consequences for the oath taker, even if that oath taker was the Queen of Gods herself. With this ironclad guarantee, Hypnos finally agreed to Hera's proposal, though not without taking additional precautions based on his previous experience. This time, Hypnos insisted on proper preparations. He would not simply follow along and improvise as he had during the Mount Ida incident. The sleep god demanded specific conditions and timing to ensure his safety after Zeus inevitably awoke and realized he'd been tricked again. It's like agreeing to help your friend with a risky scheme, but insisting on a detailed escape plan and getaway car idling nearby. Just because you're brave doesn't mean you can't also be practical. The execution of this second divine sedation shows how much Hypnos had learned from his first encounter with Zeus's wrath. Rather than transforming into a bird and applying his power directly, he operated more subtly this time. He waited until after Hera had seduced Zeus, and then gradually intensified the natural drowsiness that follows intimate encounters by working with existing biological patterns. Rather than imposing artificial sleep, he created an effect that would be harder for Zeus to identify as external manipulation when he eventually awoke. One particularly curious detail from an obscure vase painting shows Hypnos in this scene not touching Zeus directly, but rather sprinkling sleep-inducing essences from a distance. Perhaps the first depicted instance of aromatherapy in mythological history. The vase artist seems to suggest that Hypnos had developed more sophisticated techniques since his first intervention, relying less on brute force power and more on nuanced application of his abilities. The plan worked perfectly. Zeus drifted into a profound slumber, allowing Hera to send Poseidon to aid the Greeks against the Trojans. The sea god immediately turned the tide of battle, pushing back Hector and the Trojan forces. Meanwhile, Hypnos didn't stick around to witness the results of his handiwork. Learning from his previous mistake, he immediately fled to his mother's protection, anticipating Zeus's eventual awakening and the inevitable rage that would follow. When Zeus did finally awake and discover the changed battlefield situation, his fury was indeed terrible. But this time, Hypnos was nowhere to be found. The sleep god had already secured both his safety and his prize. Hera, bound by her unbreakable oath, fulfilled her promise, and Hypnos gained Pasithea as his divine bride. This second intervention demonstrated significant growth in Hypnos's divine career. No longer the naive deity easily lured into dangerous schemes with modest rewards, he had become a savvy, cosmic operator who understood his value and knew how to negotiate effectively for truly significant compensation. When you possess a power fundamental enough that even Zeus must occasionally submit to it, you might as well leverage that advantage properly. With Hera's oath fulfilled, following the second seduction of Zeus, Hypnos finally received the reward he had long desired. Marriage to Pasithea, one of the divine charities, known to Romans as the Graces. As you explore this divine partnership, you discover a union that was far more significant than mere romantic fulfillment for the sleep god. Pasithea belonged to the enchanting trio, or in some traditions, trio of trios, of goddesses who personified beauty, charm, and joy in Greek mythology. Typically listed alongside her sisters Aglaea, splendor, and Euphrosyne, mirth. Pasithea represented relaxation and meditative states, a specialization that made her uniquely compatible with the god of sleep. While her sisters focused on the external manifestations of beauty and joy, Pasithea governed internal states of tranquility and altered consciousness. You learn that Pasithea's name derives from Pasi, to all, and Thea, the goddess, meaning goddess for all, or universal goddess. This etymology hints at the universal nature of the relaxation and meditative states she represented, experiences accessible to gods and mortals alike. Some particularly esoteric texts even suggest that Pasithea was worshipped in mystery cults that practiced dream incubation, the ritual practice of sleeping in sacred spaces to receive divine messages through dreams. Historians still argue whether these cults actually existed or if these references were later inventions designed to associate established religious practices with literary mythology. The wedding of Hypnos and Pasithea must have been quite the divine event, though details of the ceremony are scarce in surviving texts. You can imagine the curious juxtaposition of elements it would have involved. The dark, drowsy energy of sleep united with the bright, graceful energy of divine beauty. The guest list would have been particularly interesting. Did Zeus attend the wedding of the deity who had twice tricked him into unconsciousness? Did Thanatos serve as his twin brother's best man, adding a slightly morbid element to the festivities? The ancient sources don't say, but the mental image of death giving a best man speech at Sleep's wedding is both amusing and strangely poignant. One obscure fragment from a Hellenistic poet describes the wedding feast as featuring specially prepared ambrosia that induced a pleasant, dreamy state in all who consumed it, allowing the divine guests to experience a taste of hypnosis power in a controlled, enjoyable context. Think of it as the mythological equivalent of serving CBD-infused cocktails at a modern wedding, a perfectly on-brand choice for the god of sleep's celebration. What made this divine marriage particularly significant was the perfect complementarity of the couple's domains. Pasithea's governance of relaxation and meditative states formed the ideal precursor to Hypnos' sleep. Together, they controlled the entire spectrum of rest, from initial relaxation to deep slumber. It's like one controlled the on-ramp to the highway of unconsciousness, while the other governed the main thoroughfare. You might wonder where this divine couple made their home after their marriage. Did Pasithea move into Hypnos' gloomy cave, brightening the place with divine grace? Or did they establish a new residence that better balanced their contrasting natures? According to a little-known Rhodian tradition, they created a unique dwelling on the border between light and darkness, with one half resembling a beautiful garden filled with poppies and night-blooming flowers, and the other half maintaining the dark, quiet characteristics necessary for Hypnos's work. The children of this divine union aren't extensively documented in surviving mythology, though some later traditions suggest that Pasithea became a co-parent to the Oneiroi, bringing a more refined and harmonious influence to dream creation. Under her guidance, some dreams became not just reflections of reality or prophetic messages, but artistic experiences in their own right, beautiful, graceful, and imbued with deeper meaning. She was essentially the first dream enhancement specialist, turning the standard dreams into premium experiences with her divine touch. What's particularly intriguing about this divine marriage is how it affected Hypnos's divine career trajectory. Prior to winning Pasithea, sleep appears in mythology primarily as a tool used by other deities or as a necessary but not particularly celebrated function. After his marriage to one of the Graces, Hypnos gained significant status elevation. Being the consort of a Grace connected him to the artistic and creative aspects of Greek culture, expanding his influence beyond the basic biological function of sleep. This status boost is reflected in later artistic depictions, where Hypnos begins appearing more frequently in symbolic contexts, scenes of divine banquets and celebrations, rather than just in martial or Trojan War related imagery. He transitions from being primarily that god who tricked Zeus to a more complex figure associated with pleasure, restoration, and even artistic inspiration. It's like watching someone's social media presence transform after they start dating. Someone more popular, suddenly they're getting invited to all the cool events. The marriage also brought practical benefits to mortals. Several ancient medical texts suggest that after uniting with Pasithea, Hypnos began delivering more therapeutic and healing sleep to humans. The combination of his soporific power with her graceful, restorative influence created ideal conditions for the body's natural healing processes. Some healing sanctuaries even maintained dual shrines to the divine couple, recognizing their complementary contributions to restorative rest. One particularly fascinating aspect of their union relates to ancient sleep practices. Archaeological evidence from several Greek healing centers shows specialized sleeping chambers where the ill would rest in pursuit of healing dreams. These chambers often contained imagery of both Hypnos and Pasithea, suggesting that invoking both deities, not just sleep alone, was considered optimal for therapeutic dreaming. It's the ancient equivalent of modern sleep clinics, recognizing that good sleep hygiene requires both physical and psychological components. As you contemplate this divine marriage while sinking deeper into your own pillows, you might appreciate how the Greeks recognized that true rest isn't just about unconsciousness, but involves a harmonious transition from wakefulness through relaxation into sleep. The union of Hypnos and Pasithea personified this understanding, creating a divine partnership that governed the entire spectrum of restorative states, perhaps watching over you now as your own consciousness begins to blur at the edges. While Hypnos is most famous for his interactions with the Olympian gods, his influence extended into the realm of mortal heroes as well. As you delve deeper into sleep mythology, you discover that Hypnos played significant roles in numerous heroic tales, sometimes appearing as an adversary, sometimes as an ally, but always as an inevitable force that even the greatest heroes had to reckon with. The relationship between heroes and sleep was complicated in Greek mythology. On one hand, sleep represented vulnerability, a state where even the mightiest warrior became defenseless. On the other hand, it was an essential restoration that enabled heroic feats. This duality created a fascinating tension in many myths, where Hypnos appears as both threat and healer to various legendary figures. Perhaps the most famous intersection between Hypnos and heroic mythology involves Heracles, or Hercules if you prefer his Roman name. During his 12 labors, specifically while capturing the cattle of Geryon, Heracles encountered Hypnos in an unexpected way. According to lesser known variants of the myth preserved in fragments from Pisander of Rhodes, Hypnos refused to help Hera against Heracles despite her demands. The sleep god, apparently having learned his lesson about meddling in the affairs of Zeus's favorites after those two near disastrous incidents with Zeus himself, declined to put the mighty hero to sleep during a vulnerable moment. This refusal infuriated Hera, who threatened Hypnos with various divine punishments. But Hypnos stood firm, reminding the Queen of Gods that Zeus's affection for his son Heracles was even stronger than his affection for Hera herself. "I've played the pawn in your marital chess games twice before," he essentially told her, "and nearly got obliterated both times. I'm not risking it again, especially not against Zeus's favorite son." It's perhaps the only recorded instance of someone saying no to Hera and surviving to tell the tale. What's particularly interesting about this interaction is what it reveals about divine politics and Hypnos's growth as a political operator. By this point in his career, the sleep god had developed enough savvy to recognize which conflicts were worth entering and which were best avoided. He'd graduated from the divine equivalent of an eager intern saying yes to every assignment, to a seasoned professional who knew when to strategically decline risky projects. Historians still argue whether this Heracles Hypnos non-interaction represents an authentic early mythological tradition or a later invention designed to explain why the seemingly indefatigable hero never appears to be affected by sleep in most of his adventures. Some scholars suggest it was added to justify the superhuman endurance often attributed to Heracles, while others see it as part of a consistent characterization of Hypnos, as increasingly cautious following his earlier misadventures. Beyond Heracles, Hypnos appears in connection with numerous other heroes, though often in less direct ways. The Argonauts, for instance, encountered the effects of Hypnos during their voyage when passing the island of Lemnos. According to some versions of the tale, the island was sacred to Hypnos due to its volcanic vents that released gases inducing drowsiness. The Argonauts found themselves unexpectedly lethargic when approaching these shores, forcing them to fight against supernatural sleepiness to maintain control of their ship. It's like trying to drive through Nebraska at night after a heavy meal. Suddenly keeping your eyes open becomes the most challenging heroic feat imaginable. You'll find Hypnos playing a more supportive role in the tale of Endymion, the shepherd. granted eternal youth and eternal sleep by Zeus, or in some versions, by the moon goddess Selene, who had fallen in love with him. In this curious myth, Hypnos's power became a preservation mechanism rather than a temporary state. Endymion slept in a cave, eternally youthful, while Selene visited him nightly. It's perhaps the strangest relationship status. It's complicated. In mythological history, one particularly obscure text, found on a damaged papyrus from Oxyrhynchus, suggests that Hypnos personally attended to Endymion's unique condition, ensuring his sleep remained perfect and preserved his youth. The text describes how Hypnos would visit the sleeping shepherd once each century to refresh his slumber, adjusting it to ensure maximum preservation and comfort. Think of it as the divine equivalent of rotating your mattress, but on a cosmic timescale. The intersection of sleep and heroism appears most vividly in the Trojan War narratives, where sleep often marks moments of critical vulnerability. Consider Rhesus, the Thracian king who arrived to support Troy, only to be killed in his sleep on his very first night by Odysseus and Diomedes. Or Patroclus, who was stunned by Apollo into a momentary sleep-like daze that left him vulnerable to Hector's fatal blow. In these instances, Hypnos appears not as a character, but as a state that creates dramatic turning points in heroic narratives. What's particularly fascinating about sleep in heroic contexts is how it functioned as a great equalizer. In a waking state, heroes like Achilles or Ajax possessed supernatural advantages that made them nearly invincible. But asleep, they became as vulnerable as any ordinary mortal. Greek audiences would have recognized this phenomenon from their own lives, no matter how wealthy, powerful, or skilled a person might be during waking hours. Sleep rendered everyone equally defenseless. Sleep also served a narrative function in heroic tales, creating necessary pauses in the relentless action of epic poetry. When Homer describes the Greek camp falling asleep at night, with only Agamemnon remaining restlessly awake, it provides both a realistic breath in the narrative and a moment for reflection. Even in the midst of the most famous war in mythology, Hypnos claimed his due hours from everyone involved. Archaeological evidence from ancient Greek military camps suggests this literary device reflected reality. Soldiers kept regular watch rotations and sleep schedules even during active campaigns. Artifacts like clay lamps and designated sleeping areas in excavated military encampments reveal that managing sleep was considered an essential aspect of warfare, just as important as managing supplies or weapons. The Greeks understood something that modern military science has confirmed. A sleep-deprived hero is an ineffective hero, regardless of their innate strengths or divine parentage. As you feel sleep tugging more insistently at your own consciousness, you might reflect on this eternal truth that connects you directly to those ancient heroes. Like them, you might resist Hypnos's influence when important tasks demand completion, but eventually, inevitably, you too will surrender to his gentle, irresistible power as you drift deeper into mythological consciousness. It's time to explore one of the most fascinating relationships in the divine family tree, the twin brotherhood of Hypnos and Thanatos, sleep and death. These siblings represent perhaps the most profound conceptual pairing in Greek mythology, their complementary functions revealing deep insights about how the ancients understood consciousness, existence, and the boundaries between different states of being. Born together from the depths of night, Hypnos and Thanatos embodied temporary and permanent cessations of conscious life. The Greeks observed the obvious physical similarities between sleep and death, the closed eyes, the still body, the departure of active consciousness, and conceptualized them as divine brothers working in tandem. It's probably the most philosophical family relationship in the entire pantheon, rooted in the profound observation that sleep is indeed a kind of temporary, reversible death. You might find it somewhat disconcerting to think of your nightly slumber as a practice death. But for the Greeks, this connection wasn't necessarily frightening. Instead, it provided a conceptual framework for understanding both phenomena. If sleep was a state you entered and returned from regularly, perhaps death too was not an absolute end, but simply a longer, deeper state from which return was different rather than impossible. It's like sleep and death were running essentially the same cosmic program, just with different settings for the duration and return parameters. In artistic representations, the twin gods were often depicted together, sometimes carrying the body of a fallen warrior. One of the most famous examples appears on the Euphronios crater, a red figure vessel showing Hypnos and Thanatos lifting the body of Sarpedon from the battlefield of Troy. Hypnos appears youthful and gentle, while Thanatos often has a more somber countenance, yet they work in perfect coordination. It's like watching a perfectly choreographed divine paramedic team, one that doesn't resuscitate, but rather ensures a dignified transition to the afterlife. What's particularly interesting about this twin relationship is how it influenced Greek attitudes toward both sleep and death. By connecting these states through divine brotherhood, the Greeks created a conceptual bridge that made death seem less alien and frightening. If you regularly entered the realm of Hypnos without fear, perhaps entering the realm of his brother needn't be viewed with absolute terror either. It's a remarkably sophisticated psychological framework for processing mortality wrapped in mythological imagery. Despite their conceptual similarities, the twins maintained distinct individual characteristics and responsibilities. Hypnos focused on the regulatory cycles necessary for life to function properly, while Thanatos managed the final transition that concluded mortal existence. Hypnos worked with timing and rhythm, while Thanatos dealt with ultimate finality. One particularly obscure Orphic text suggests that the twins occasionally disagreed about jurisdiction, especially in cases of extremely deep sleep or near death experiences, where the boundaries between their domains blurred. Imagine the divine equivalent of siblings arguing, "That comma patient is clearly in my territory." No, they're just experiencing extremely deep sleep. Back off, brother. The collaborative relationship between the twins appears most explicitly in war contexts. Homer describes them working together to remove fallen heroes from the battlefield, carrying the dead to their proper afterlife destinations with gentle efficiency. This tandem function reflects a remarkable theological sophistication, recognition that transitions between states of consciousness, whether temporary or permanent, required divine facilitation and care. Historians still argue whether certain sleep states were considered to fall under joint jurisdiction of both brothers. Ancient medical texts describe conditions resembling comas or persistent vegetative states as dwelling in the borderlands between Hypnos and Thanatos, suggesting recognition of liminal states that didn't fit neatly into either category. Some scholars interpret these references as evidence of a surprisingly nuanced ancient understanding of consciousness disorders, while others view them as simply poetic descriptions without medical significance. What's particularly revealing about the twin relationship is how it affected worship practices. While Thanatos received few direct cult offerings, being generally considered inevitable rather than negotiable, Hypnos received considerably more positive religious attention. People established small household shrines to the sleep god, left him offerings, and actively sought his favor. It's as if by maintaining a good relationship with the more approachable twin, people hoped to ensure that when they eventually met the grimmer brother, the family connection might somehow work in their favor. One particularly quirky aspect of the brothers' relationship appears in a fragmentary text from a temple near Epidaurus, which suggests that they occasionally traded places for brief periods. According to this obscure tradition, once each year during a special night, Hypnos would take on death-like characteristics, while Thanatos would adopt the gentler aspects of sleep. During this cosmic role reversal, sleep became unusually deep and death-like, while those who died passed with unusual peacefulness, as if merely falling asleep. Modern scholars generally view this as a ritual invention rather than mainstream belief, possibly associated with specific mystery cult practices rather than general religious concepts. The twins also shared certain powers, particularly the ability to render individuals unconscious and insensible. However, they applied these similar abilities toward different ends and with different durations. It's like they both knew how to flip the same switch, but one always turned it back on while the other left it off permanently. This shared technical capability with divergent purposes reflected the Greeks' understanding that similar physical states could have profoundly different meanings and consequences depending on their context and duration. As you find yourself sinking ever deeper into drowsiness, approaching your own nightly meeting with Hypnos, you might appreciate how this ancient conceptual pairing still resonates with human experience. We still describe particularly deep sleep as being dead to the world, still use phrases like sleep is the cousin of death, still recognize the phenomenological similarities between these states while acknowledging their profound differences. The twin gods, Hypnos and Thanatos, captured something universal about human consciousness, something that transcends their particular mythological framework and speaks to fundamental patterns of existence. Perhaps tonight, as Hypnos approaches with his gentle touch, you might briefly consider his more somber brother, not with fear, but with the philosophical equanimity the Greeks cultivated through this divine relationship, recognizing that transitions of consciousness, whether temporary or permanent, have been given meaning through stories for thousands of years. As your mythological journey continues, you now turn your attention to how Hypnos was visualized. and represented across the centuries of ancient art and literature. Unlike the Olympian gods with their standardized imagery, Zeus with his thunderbolt, Poseidon with his trident, Hypnos's visual identity evolved significantly through time, reflecting changing attitudes toward sleep itself. The earliest depictions of Hypnos, dating from the Archaic period, roughly 8th–6th centuries BCE, show him as a bearded man. Similar to other male deities of the era, there was nothing particularly sleep-like about these early representations. No visual cues that would immediately identify him as the god of slumber rather than, say, a minor river god or local deity. It's like the earliest artistic directors hadn't quite figured out the right brand identity for sleep personified. By the classical period, 5th–4th centuries BCE, artists had developed more distinctive iconography for Hypnos. He began appearing as a winged youth, often carrying his signature implements, a branch dripping with water from the river Lethe, forgetfulness, and a horn from which he poured sleep onto weary mortals. These wings weren't the large, majestic eagle wings associated with major gods like Eros, but smaller, often butterfly-like appendages that suggested gentle movement through the night. Some vase paintings even show these wings attached to his temples rather than his back, creating a strange but distinctive silhouette that immediately identified him to ancient viewers. You're particularly intrigued by a peculiar detail that appears in several classical representations. Hypnos with inverted torch. This symbol, also associated with Thanatos, represented the temporary extinguishing of consciousness. What makes this iconographic element fascinating is how it creates visual continuity between the twin brothers while also distinguishing them. While Thanatos' torch was permanently extinguished, Hypnos's was merely turned downward, suggesting temporary dimming rather than permanent darkness, a subtle but profound distinction that captured the essential difference between sleep and death. One particularly obscure artifact, a small bronze figurine discovered near ancient Corinth, shows Hypnos with multiple sets of wings, including tiny wings attached to his sandals similar to those of Hermes. This curious representation suggests a conceptual connection between sleep and transitions or journeys, perhaps reflecting the understanding of sleep as a journey to another state of consciousness. Historians still argue whether this unusual, multi-winged depiction represents a regional cult variation or simply an individual artist's creative interpretation. Either way, it demonstrates the flexibility in how ancient peoples visualized this elusive deity. As you explore Hellenistic art, 323–31 BCE, you notice Hypnos becoming increasingly sensual and beautiful in artistic renderings. This period's characteristic emotionalism and emphasis on physical beauty transformed the sleep god from a somewhat neutral functionary into an alluring, almost seductive figure. Think less clinical anesthesiologist and more irresistibly charming entity who makes surrender to unconsciousness seem positively desirable. This shift likely reflected the Hellenistic interest in psychological states and personal experience, along with the era's general tendency toward more emotionally charged religious imagery of fascinating alabaster relief from this period shows Hypnos gently embracing a sleeping figure, his wings protectively curled around them. The intimacy of this image captures something profound about the Greek conception of sleep, not as an absence or void, but as an active embrace by a caring deity. It's less powering down and more being held, a significantly more comforting conceptualization of the unconscious state we spend nearly a third of our lives experiencing. When Roman artists inherited the Greek mythological tradition, they adapted hypnos, now called somnus in Latin, to their more pragmatic cultural sensibilities. Roman depictions tend to be less mystical and more functional, often showing somnus in household contexts rather than cosmic scenes. Small Roman household shrines frequently included relief images of somnus associated with practical prayers for good sleep rather than the more abstract theological concepts of his Greek original. One particularly charming Roman fresco from Pompeii shows Somnus as a plump, contented figure reclining on a comfortable couch, surrounded by poppies, a clear reference to their sleep inducing properties that were well understood in antiquity. The accompanying Latin inscription roughly translates to "Come, gentle Somnus, to this house where children wail and parents long for your sweet gift." Apparently, Roman parents dealing with colicky babies were just as desperate for sleep as modern ones. Some aspects of human experience truly are timeless. You're particularly amused by how Roman funerary art sometimes depicted the deceased as sleeping rather than dead, with Somnus rather than his brother featured in the imagery. This euphemistic representation, increasingly common in later Roman periods, suggests growing discomfort with direct confrontation of mortality. It's the ancient equivalent of our modern funeral parlors that go to extraordinary lengths to make the deceased appear at rest rather than, well, dead. Some things really never change. In poetic representations, Hypnos undergoes equally interesting transformations across the centuries. Homer's Iliad presents him as a powerful but somewhat mechanical functionary, a divine tool used primarily to advance plot points by rendering key characters unconscious at critical moments. By contrast, later lyric poets like Alcman described him in almost romantic terms as a gentle, desirable presence who brings not just unconsciousness, but pleasant restoration. Ovid's Metamorphoses gives us perhaps the most vivid literary description of Hypnos's realm, describing his cave where sluggish sleep reclines on his soft couch, his limbs relaxed in slumber. Around him lie empty dreams, countless as harvest leaves, as sand cast on the shore, as pebbles tossed upon the beach. This image of sleep himself, sleeping surrounded by dormant dreams, became enormously influential in later Western art and literature, inspiring everything from Renaissance paintings to modern fantasy literature. As you sink deeper toward your own appointment with Hypnos, you might notice how these ancient representations continue to influence our modern conception of sleep, the winged deliverer of dreams, the gentle embrace of restorative slumber, the river of forgetfulness that separates waking from dreaming. These ancient images persist in our poetry, our metaphors, even our sleep medication advertisements. What's particularly remarkable about these artistic representations is how they gave tangible form to something fundamentally intangible. Sleep isn't an object you can photograph or a person you can sketch from life. By personifying it as hypnos, ancient artists created a visual vocabulary for discussing and understanding a universal human experience that otherwise resists direct representation. In turning an abstract state into a person with a face, wings, and story, they made the mystery of sleep slightly more approachable. While gods like Apollo and Athena enjoyed massive temples and elaborate festivals, Hypnos received a more intimate, domestic form of worship. As you continue exploring sleep mythology, you discover the fascinating variety of rituals, prayers, and offerings that ancient people dedicated to the god who never slept himself. Unlike the grand public ceremonies devoted to major Olympians, worship of Hypnos typically occurred in private household settings. Small shrines called hypnaea existed in many Greek homes, usually located in or near bedchambers. These weren't impressive architectural structures, but modest installations, perhaps a small alcove containing a simple image of the sleep god, often accompanied by dried poppies or other soporific plants. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of your bedside table, with its melatonin supplements, eye mask, and white noise machine, a dedicated space for sleep supporting tools. The timing of prayers to Hypnos followed a logical pattern. Most supplications occurred during the evening transition from day to night as people prepared for sleep. A typical prayer might request gentle approach, restorative rest, or pleasant dreams. Parents often added specific requests for their children, asking Hypnos to ensure their offspring slept soundly through the night. Any modern parent who's experienced a toddler's 3 a.m. wake up call can certainly sympathize with this particular prayer tradition. Some things truly are universal across millennia. What you find particularly interesting are the material offerings presented to Hypnos. Unlike the substantial sacrifices demanded by major gods, Hypnos received more modest tokens, libations of diluted wine, never undiluted, as this was considered too stimulating, honey, associated with sweetness of rest, and milk, connected to peaceful childhood sleep. These liquid offerings were typically poured directly onto the ground near the sleeping area, allowing them to seep into the earth and symbolically reach the chthonic realm where Hypnos dwelled. One particularly curious offering, mentioned in a fragmentary text from Rhodes, involved sleep pebbles, small, smooth stones collected from riversides, particularly those believed to be fed by underground sources connected to the river Lethe. These stones would be placed under pillows or near the bed, supposedly helping conduct hypnosis power to the sleeper. Historians still argue whether this represented a widespread practice or merely a regional folk tradition. Either way, it's not so different from modern crystal enthusiasts placing amethyst under their pillows to promote better sleep. Humans have always sought physical objects to mediate supernatural assistance. Herbal offerings played a significant role in Hypnos worship. The ancient Greeks were skilled botanical pharmacologists who understood the sedative properties of numerous plants. Offerings of dried poppy heads, valerian root, chamomile and lavender appeared frequently in domestic Hypnos shrines. These weren't just symbolic gifts, but practical tools that released sleep inducing scents into bedchambers. It's the original aromatherapy, combining religious devotion with practical sleep hygiene in a seamless blend of the sacred and utilitarian. You learn about a particularly fascinating ritual practiced in healing sanctuaries dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine. Before engaging in incubation, the practice of sleeping in temples to receive healing dreams, suppliants would first make offerings to Hypnos to ensure they achieved the proper state of sleep for divine dream communication. This preliminary step was considered essential for successful dream healing. You couldn't receive Asclepius's medical advice if you were tossing and turning all night. It's like making sure your Zoom connection is stable before an important virtual doctor's appointment. An obscure papyrus fragment describes a peculiar ritual from a small community near Thessaly where worshippers created sleep masks from linen soaked in a mild opium solution, then dried and painted with symbols of Hypnos. These masks would be placed over the eyes during sleep, providing both physical darkness and a mild sedative effect absorbed through the skin. Modern pharmacologists have confirmed that such a delivery mechanism could indeed produce mild sedative effects, making this perhaps one of the earliest examples of transdermal medication. Ancient innovation at its finest. The social dimensions of Hypnos worship reveal interesting cultural attitudes toward sleep itself. Unlike many religious practices that emphasized community worship, Hypnos rituals were predominantly private or family based. This reflected the Greeks' understanding of sleep as an intimate, vulnerable state, requiring protection rather than public celebration. You wouldn't announce to the entire village that you were about to sleep. That would be like posting your vacation dates and home address on a public bulletin board. Some privacy concerns apparently predate social media by millennia. One particularly interesting aspect of ancient sleep rituals involved protective measures against unwanted dreams. While Hypnos himself controlled sleep, his children, the Oneiroi, determined dream content, and not all dreams were welcome visitors. Archaeological evidence from several sites reveals small clay or wax figurines of Hypnos positioned facing outward from beds, supposedly to filter out harmful dream spirits while allowing beneficial ones to pass. It's essentially the mythological version of a dream bouncer, checking IDs at the velvet rope of your consciousness and only letting in the VIP dreams. For those suffering from insomnia, a condition well documented in ancient medical texts, more elaborate rituals might be performed. These often involved symbolic acts of surrendering consciousness, such as catching sleep in special vessels by speaking incantations over cups of water collected at twilight. The water would then be sprinkled around the bed, creating a kind of sleep-inducing circle. Modern sleep scientists might scoff, but the ritual likely produced real psychological benefits through the power of suggestion and the establishment of consistent bedtime routines, approaches still recommended by contemporary sleep specialists. Perhaps the most curious ritual associated with Hypnos worship involved dream incubation for creative inspiration. According to Pausanias, Certain poets and artists would practice a specific form of hypnos devotion designed not for rest but for creative insight. They would sleep in special chambers after making offerings specifically requesting dreams that would inspire their work. Some even kept writing implements or clay nearby to record ideas immediately upon waking. It's like the ancient Greek version of keeping a dream journal or the modern practice of sleep storming, deliberately using the transition between sleep states to generate creative breakthroughs. As our exploration of sleep rituals comes to a close, you might notice similarities between these ancient practices and your own bedtime routines. The specific beliefs have changed, but the fundamental human need to create transitions between wakefulness and sleep remains constant. Your evening screen time limits, bedtime reading ritual, or preferred pillow arrangement serve much the same purpose as those ancient offerings of diluted wine and poppy heads, creating favorable conditions for Hypnos's arrival, even if you no longer address him by name. As our mythological journey approaches its conclusion, it's time to contemplate the central paradox that has woven through our entire exploration. Why would the god of sleep himself never need to sleep? This fundamental contradiction reveals deeper truths about how the ancient Greeks conceptualized both divinity and the nature of sleep itself. The most straightforward explanation is purely practical. Someone needs to mind the store. If Hypnos himself took regular naps, who would oversee the distribution of sleep to the rest of creation? It's like being the only barista in a busy coffee shop. You can't very well make yourself a drink and then join the customers in enjoying it. The cosmic machinery requires constant administration, and Hypnos's eternal wakefulness ensures that everyone else can enjoy their regular periods of rest. But beyond this functional explanation lies a more profound theological concept. The Greeks often conceptualized their gods as perfect, idealized versions of the forces they controlled. Zeus didn't need to experience being struck by lightning to control thunder. Poseidon didn't need to drown to understand the sea. Similarly, Hypnos represented the perfect knowledge of sleep without requiring the experience of it. His comprehensive understanding of slumber was innate rather than experiential. He knew sleep in its essence rather than as a participant. You might find this concept somewhat frustrating from a modern perspective. We tend to value experiential knowledge over theoretical understanding. The chef who tastes their own dishes, the doctor who shows empathy for conditions they've personally experienced. To us, there seems something almost unfair about a sleep god who never experiences the very state he governs. It's like a film critic who's never watched a movie or a food writer who's never eaten. How can they truly understand what they're responsible for? One particularly quirky tradition, preserved only in fragments from a local cult near ancient Halicarnassus, offers a different explanation. According to these obscure texts, Hypnos actually did sleep once, at the very beginning of creation, but his single experience of slumber was so perfect and complete that he never needed to repeat it. This one and done approach to sleep suggests a concept of ideal experience that doesn't require repetition to maintain its effects. Imagine if your first cup of coffee was so perfect that you remained caffeinated for all eternity. You'd save a fortune on Starbucks, though you'd miss out on all those amusing misspellings of your name. This raises interesting questions about the nature of divine experience versus mortal experience. Humans need repetitive cycles of sleep because our mortal bodies require regular restoration. Gods, being immortal and theoretically perfect, might not need these restorative cycles at all. Perhaps Hypnos's sleeplessness isn't a paradox, but rather evidence of his divinity, an indication that he exists beyond the biological necessities that govern mortal life. Historians still argue whether the sleepless nature of Hypnos represented a sophisticated theological concept or simply a narrative convenience that allowed him to function effectively as a mythological character. Was his eternal wakefulness meant to convey profound truths about divine nature, or was it just more practical for storytelling purposes to have the sleep god always on duty? These interpretations aren't mutually exclusive. Mythology often operates simultaneously on practical, narrative, and philosophical levels. Throughout our exploration of Hypnos's mythology, we've encountered numerous instances where sleep serves as a boundary marker between different states of being, between consciousness and unconsciousness, between divine control and vulnerability, between life and death. Perhaps Hypnos himself, eternally poised at this boundary without crossing it, represents the ultimate liminal figure, the doorkeeper who facilitates transitions without experiencing them personally. It's like being the world's best party planner who never actually attends any of the events they organize. The legacy of the sleepless sleep god extends far beyond ancient mythology. Our modern understanding of sleep continues to be shaped by concepts first articulated through the personification of Hypnos. When sleep scientists distinguish between different sleep stages, they're engaging in a more technical version of categorizing the various aspects of Hypnos's domain. When we speak of falling asleep or sleep coming to us, we're unconsciously preserving the ancient concept of sleep as an external force that acts upon us rather than simply an internal biological state. This external conception of sleep as something that visits us rather than something we simply do persists in our language and thinking today. We still experience sleep as something that arrives or eludes us rather than a function we control directly. In this sense, Hypnos continues his nightly work, touching our eyelids with his poppy-laden branch, even if we no longer acknowledge him by name. As you feel yourself drifting closer to your own appointment with sleep, you might appreciate the elegant wisdom in personifying this mysterious state of consciousness. By giving sleep a face, a story, and a personality, the ancient Greeks made comprehensible something that otherwise resists direct understanding. We still don't fully understand why we sleep from a neurological perspective, despite all our scientific advances. The mystery that the Greeks addressed through mythology remains partially unsolved by modern science. Perhaps tonight, as you surrender to sleep's gentle embrace, you might briefly imagine Hypnos watching over you, the god who never needs rest, ensuring that you receive the slumber you require. In that moment of transition between wakefulness and dreams, you're experiencing something that has remained remarkably consistent throughout human history: the gentle surrender to a power both intimately familiar and profoundly mysterious. As you lie here, feeling the weight of wakefulness slowly lifting from your body, let yourself sink deeper into the soft, enveloping comfort that surrounds you. Your breathing naturally slows, becoming deeper, more rhythmic, like gentle waves lapping at a distant shore. The stories of Hypnos and his realm have prepared your mind for this transition, this gentle crossing from one state of being into another. The ancient Greeks understood something profound about this moment, this threshold between consciousness and dreams, recognizing it as a sacred transition worthy of divine personification. As your thoughts begin to drift and blur at the edges, becoming less distinct, less demanding of your attention, you're participating in the same human experience that inspired those myths thousands of years ago. Perhaps somewhere in the darkness, behind your closed eyelids, the winged god of sleep approaches with his gentle step, carrying his branch of river Lethe water, ready to touch your forehead with the lightest of caresses. Or perhaps his children, the Oneiroi, are gathering around, preparing dreams that will soon unfold in your sleeping mind, painting landscapes and scenarios that exist nowhere else in the universe except within the gallery of your own imagination. As consciousness gradually recedes like a tide pulling away from shore, remember that sleep isn't merely the absence of wakefulness, but a positive state with its own value and purpose. Just as hypnos wasn't merely the negation of alertness, but a positive divine force with his own mythology and meaning, your sleep tonight isn't just a pause in your conscious existence, but an active, healing, necessary journey through another mode of being. May Hypnos bring you gentle slumber. May Pasithea grant you perfect relaxation. And may Morpheus craft for you the most pleasant of dreams as you drift away into the welcoming darkness of night. Sweet dreams.